Good morning and welcome to the second day of APAC's Legislative Leadership Summit. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APACS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Thank you for joining us as we have a timely discussion on the Asian American experience, what the community faces today. First, I'd like to remind everyone to visit our exhibitor sponsor booths. We really appreciate all of the support that they've given us in producing the Legislative Leadership Summit this year. And please be sure to visit their booths as well as download the program book from the APACS website. Before we begin, it's my honor to introduce Congresswoman Grace Meng for opening remarks. Congresswoman Meng currently represents New York's 6th District and is a member of the House Appropriations Committee. She continues to lead in our community by serving as first vice chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, also known as CAPAC. We are thrilled to have her join us today, so please welcome Congresswoman Grace Meng.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you today, and thanks to everyone for joining. Thank you so much to Madeline and the whole APEX team for putting together today's conversation, and a huge thank you to all these amazing panelists who are here today to share their insights and to help us craft solutions to combat anti-Asian hate. The most recent data reveals that there were more than 6,600 hate incidents reported between March 2020 and March 2021. Asian American women make up over 64% of all these reports. Our youth represent 11% of incidents, and our elderly make up over 6% of incidents. In my home state of New York alone, anti-Asian hate crimes have increased over 200% in the first quarter of this year compared to all of 2020. The issue of anti-Asian hate crimes is an American issue, and we cannot wait any longer to have solutions. A few weeks ago, the Senate passed my bill and Senator Hirono's COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act with overwhelming bipartisan support, which would assign point personnel at the Department of Justice to quickly review these types of incidents and to issue guidance on local law entities to help victims more easily report these incidents and to do so online and in multiple languages. It would also direct federal agencies to coordinate with community-based organizations to raise awareness about hate crimes reporting and to find ways to talk about the coronavirus pandemic that are not racist or discriminatory. With the House back in session, we are ready to pass our bill and get it to President Biden's desk. As we are all aware on this call, the contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in our nation's history is drastically underrepresented in K through 12 curriculum. Growing up, our children may learn at best a few sentences about Chinese laborers and building the Transcontinental Railroad, or about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. But the history and contributions of AAPIs run much deeper, and the erasure of our stories perpetuates the idea that we are forever foreigners. That's why I've introduced my Teaching APA History Act to promote the teaching and learning of APA history in K through 12 schools across our nation. And we are working with our colleagues in the Black and Hispanic Caucus and Native American members to ensure that our children are learning a more diverse and complete history. I'm also leading a bill to help establish an AAPI museum. We cannot focus on tearing down the walls of biases and discrimination until we have a full teaching of what American history truly is. Also, as a member of the Appropriations Committee, I'm also CAPAC's Appropriations Task Force Chair. Together with our CAPAC Chairwoman, Judy Chu, we are fighting to ensure federal resources are directed to address issues that affect the Asian American community, including addressing anti-Asian hate. This means prioritizing community-based solutions for combating hate incidents, like the Justice Department's Community Relations Service. ensuring that AAPI small businesses have access to the resources they need to thrive under the Small Business Administration, and to protect AAPI students from bullying. The pain of our community needs to be recognized, addressed, and mitigated. We have to fight to ensure that government at all levels are taking every step possible to combat the spread of anti-Asian hate. Thank you so much, and I hope that you all stay safe and well.
Thank you, Congresswoman Meng, for always leading. I appreciate all of your leadership. It's now my pleasure to introduce Elaine Quijano, who will be the moderator for our panel. Ms. Quijano is an anchor for CBSN, CBS News' 24/7 digital streaming service, and a correspondent for CBS News, contributing to all CBS News broadcasts and platforms. And she's always been a supporter of AAPIs, having served as the 2016 Mistress of Ceremonies of our gala, which we all lovingly call Asian Prom. And so we are excited to have her today as our moderator. Elaine, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Madeline. That's right. Asian Prom will live forever in my memory as a fun and unique opportunity to meet so many of you. I'm really humbled to join this discussion today. Growing up, my parents, who immigrated to Chicago from the Philippines, taught me to work hard, keep my head down, and to allow my work to speak for itself. As a college student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, I was supposed to earn an engineering degree, but I happened to take an intro to broadcast journalism class, and there I discovered the power of story. Well, now we find ourselves as Asian Americans in the middle of another difficult chapter in our story. And the esteemed panelists joining us today are playing critical roles, both in chronicling this moment and in writing the next chapter. Helen Zia is an author, activist, and a spokesperson for the Justice for Vincent Chin campaign. Her first book, Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People, examines the contemporary civil rights struggles of Asian Americans. Helen has spoken out frequently on a range of issues, from human rights to fighting gender and hate violence and homophobia. Janelle Wong is a professor of American Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland. Her research examines race, immigration, and political mobilization. She's worked closely with social service, labor, and civil rights groups, focusing on the Asian American population. Janelle is also an author whose books include Democracy's Promise, Immigrants and American Civic Institutions, and she co-authored a book called Asian American Political Participation, Emerging Constituents and Their Political Identities. That book was based on the first national multilingual, multi-ethnic survey of Asian Americans. John C. Yang is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, a group focused on civil rights and empowering Asian Americans in multiple ways, including public policy, advocacy, and education. John served in the Obama administration as senior advisor for trade and strategic initiatives at the Commerce Department, where he was principal advisor to Secretary Penny Pritzker on issues related to Asia. Now, his extensive resume includes being co-chair of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans and co-founder of the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center, a nonprofit dedicated to addressing the legal needs of Asian Pacific Americans in Metro Washington, D.C. Manjusha Kulkarni is Executive Director of Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, a coalition of over 40 community-based organizations that serves and represents the 1.5 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County. Manju also serves as a lecturer in the Asian American Studies Department of UCLA. In 2014, she received the White House Champions of Change Award from President Obama for her commitment to improving healthcare access for Asian American communities. And in March of 2020, she co-founded StopAAPIHate, the nation's leading aggregator of COVID-19 related hate incidents against AAPIs. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you. Thank you all so much for being with us. Before we start, I want to let folks know we will have time for audience questions at the end, so please use the Q&A section to ask those questions, and we will try to get through as many as we can before the end of the session. So hello, panelists. How are you? How's everyone? We ready to
good.
dive in? Okay, good. So much to cover. And I really want to just start with a big picture question. Helen, I'm going to begin with you. What do you see as the biggest challenges in this moment that the Asian American community is facing?
I think clearly the one thing that is running as a thread through our Asian American communities and families is just the fear of stepping outside and having physical attack or harassment or something terrible happening to the kids as schools are opening up on the way to school, going back to work and getting on public transportation, all of those things. But beyond that, really, what underlies this wave, this tsunami of anti-Asian racism is the racism. And we know that this is something that's not new. It is part and parcel of the Asian American experience. It's part of our history from the very beginning of when Asian Americans first stepped onto this continent as Asians or as trying to be accepted as Americans. And so that question of being accepted versus always being seen not only as a foreigner, but a foreign invader, an enemy. And how do we treat enemies? Well, they get eliminated. And so we see this as part of where we are today. And the lack of recognition of that underlying racism, and that racism for Asian Americans is part of white supremacy, of how Asian Americans experience white supremacy and how we're used against other people. I mean, it's a big question. You asked a big picture question, but the main underlying cause of what we're experiencing today, what we have to recognize, and really what other people in society have to recognize, is this isn't just attacks, microaggressions that people seem to think are small, but they're not. They're also part of what is white supremacy. And so the racism is really, and recognizing the racism to me is the biggest problem that we face.
Janelle, I want to ask you the same question. As an academic, someone who's studied this intersection of race and political power, what do you see as the biggest challenges that the Asian American community is facing today?
Thank you so much, Elaine. The challenge we're facing, I think, is multifaceted, but it really does come down to what Helen just mentioned, which is we need to confront racism. And to me, the biggest challenge is really thinking about how to do that within an interracial coalition. And we're kind of at a crossroads right now. I've been seeing so many viral videos in our community, and I think we need to put these into context. So a lot of the videos show, for instance, a Black attacker on an Asian American person. And, this is something that we have to understand in context. For instance, we know the media tends to overrepresent Black men in coverage of crimes and news about crimes. And we as a community need to understand the biases in some of the media coverage and not become susceptible to these narratives that stoke anti-Black racism within our communities. And so I think this is part of the move going forward, is that we need to look at what's happening to our community in a larger racial context to know that 10% of Asian Americans this year have reported a hate crime, and so have 10% of Black Americans, so have about 10% of Latinx Americans. And so we are all in this together, and we must move forward together.
Janelle, you raised some really important questions that I just have to say, I know a lot of AAPI journalists are asking in newsrooms across the country because we have a different understanding of the dynamic that you just spelled out. John, let me ask you the same thing. What are the biggest challenges the Asian American community is facing?
Sure. And actually, I appreciate where Janelle started with respect to talk about racism as a whole and how we need to stand together. And let me also perhaps put a finer point on what Janelle is saying about some of these viral videos. The statistics just showed the opposite thing. There was an NIH study that was done, I think it was published in January of this year, that showed that 76 of the attackers against Asian Americans over this course of history, not just this past year, but just through a longer arc of history, have been Caucasian. I believe a University of Michigan professor is coming out with a study. I know she's been interviewed on this, that says that only 5% of attackers where the race as identified are African American. So let's be very, very clear that yes, there is true that there are some viral videos that are out there, but we have to think about who is fomenting those videos, who is trying to create these divisions. To back up a little bit in terms of the larger picture, I agree with agree with Helen and Janelle that sort of, there's two things that I would say, and it's a paradox. There's both a visibility piece and an invisibility piece. The visibility piece is what's causing fear for our community, that being seen causes us to be attacked. Being seen causes us to endure harassment. But then there's the invisibility piece, is that we cannot afford to not be seen. Part of the issues have always been that we have not been seen, whether it is in history books, whether it is in politics. And so that's also at a meta level, I think what we need to think about is making sure that we're navigating those two different theories, those two different stratagems.
Manju, what about you? What are your thoughts on the biggest challenges the Asian American community is facing today?
The last 15 months, Elaine, have been some of the most difficult of our lifetimes. And I think for the Asian American Pacific Islander community, we've been hit on several fronts. Obviously, COVID-19 has really, I think, been an extremely difficult challenge for so many of our communities. If you look at the Pacific Islander community specifically, and what they faced in terms of morbidity and mortality rates related to COVID, also parts of our Asian American community as well. And then on top of that, you have these issues of economic insecurity and then the hate that goes along with COVID-19. And you know, at StopAAPIHate, we've documented 6,600 since March of last year. And, you know, I think it really should give us pause. And as both John and Janelle and Helen mentioned, that invisibility question is very much there. And I think also, you know, what's really come back is issues related to the model minority myth and how our communities really, the struggles we've experienced, the challenges have not been taken as seriously as so many other communities. And I think this gives us an opportunity today to really rebuff those myths, to shed light on what's happening against our communities and those struggles that we are most definitely experiencing.
Manju, on this invisibility issue, talk to me about some of the systemic barriers. Why do you think historically the stories of Asian Americans have not been addressed in this country?
Well, as I mentioned, I think the model minority myth plays a significant role in that. And, you know, as folks may remember, this is something that was coined in the 1960s when Professor Peterson at Berkeley really tried to juxtapose Asian American communities against African American communities, creating this wedge, which really is both inaccurate and totally inappropriate, because our communities do face struggles. Some are economically affluent or middle class, doing well, but many parts of our community are not. And so we're not any different, I think, than those in the African American, Latinx, or white communities. The other thing that was so troubling, Elaine, about that framing is it was really about silencing as well. And what Professor Peterson said is that we were somehow a model because we didn't speak out. We didn't challenge, for example, the Japanese American incarceration. We didn't challenge so much of what was inequitable in our systems. And somehow he thought African Americans doing that was somehow a problem. So I think, you know, we know that we've been part of a resistance movement for centuries, really, in the United States. And I think what you're hearing today is also part of that resistance, that we're not going to take what's happening against our communities lightly, and we're going to fight back in all the ways that we can.
So John, let me ask you next then, as someone who has really pushed hard against systemic barriers to telling Asian American stories and to raising Asian American issues, what have been some of the main challenges from your perspective? What have been those barriers to getting Asian American issues addressed?
Well, I think one of the things we should talk about, and this sounds granular, but it's very important, is data. The fact is that we have so little data on the Asian American community. And when I'm talking about data, let's recognize, I think most of the people that are watching this know how diverse our community is. We're talking about over 50 different ethnicities, over 100 different languages, not to mention different dialects of those languages. And as Manju was saying, our experiences have been different. Yet there is no monolith that represents the Asian American community. Yes, you can say that certain communities in the Asian American community are doing well, but then by saying that, you are ignoring the needs of the Asian American communities that are not doing well. And then you're effectively silencing them, rendering them invisible. So one piece that we really should be thinking about is how do we get more data on our community and to use that data to drive better policy. Certainly what Janelle is doing with AAPI data helps to create that data. Certainly what Manjusha is doing with StopAAPIHate helps to create that data. But we also need, in the context of an Apex conference, right, to talk about what governments can do to create better data, whether it's through data disaggregation, which is a huge issue in our community right now for the federal government to take on, whether it is to talk to polling surveys, polling outfits, to make sure that when they are doing presidential election surveys, they include Asian Americans as one of the sub-tabs. They always will include African Americans, Latinx, they do it by gender, they do it by age, but Asian Americans traditionally, except for one poll that I saw during the 2020 election cycle, had a sub-tab for Asian Americans. We all have to do better. And when I say we, some of the onus has to fall on government, has to fall on corporations, has to fall on private entities to raise that visibility.
Janelle, I want to ask you the same thing, but from your lens, because I wonder what it's like in the world of academia with respect to gathering the data that John is talking about. Has there been an emphasis in the past on the importance of understanding such a diverse population as the Asian American community? Is it changing now? If so, why or why not? What are you seeing?
I think that the challenges that John raised continue to be quite high barriers to understanding our community. And I think it's really important to focus in on the role that government entities can play in allowing us to see more and collect more high quality data on our communities. And this is both at the federal level, but also at the also at the local level. One of the biggest challenges now is not only kind of passing those bills at the state level and in other kinds of government agencies to collect the data, but also to ensure that the implementation of that legislation, of those rules, of those kinds of directives is strong, consistent, and actually leads to high quality data. So what we're seeing in some places is that people have been told to collect the data. There's legislation to collect it, but it's not collected in a consistent way. It is not collected in a user-friendly way. And so I think we need to go to the next stage of not only saying, look, we need to collect these data, but also how are you going to do it? Are you going to fund it? And are you going to make it accessible to our communities so that they can also use it to better understand and to create better policies?
So I know as a journalist, behind every data point, there is a story. And Helen, let me ask you about that, because invisibility is not just an issue when it comes to data, but of course, in popular culture and in helping Americans at large sort of understand what the Asian American experience has been. What do you think, as an author, as someone who has seen what that lack of representation in the worlds of literature, in popular culture, how that's manifested itself, what do you think have been some of the systemic barriers to getting those Asian American stories told beyond just the data points that we're talking about here?
Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more with everything that Janelle, Manju, and John have said about the invisibility and the need to be more, to be counted. I mean, to be seen. That's what all of this is about. And the damage of it is everywhere. And when you ask what are the barriers, the invisibility itself is the systemic barrier. And why do I say that? When we're talking about the model minority, that is a more recent rendition of the one-dimensional way that Asian Americans are viewed. The other way is the enemy. And either way, the enemy is the, or the coolie labor enemy is dispensable. It's labor that's useful when we need it to build a railroad, to answer phone calls in the middle of the night, to be the high-tech coolie. But when it's not useful, it's eliminated, thrown away, just like the ethnic cleansing that took place in the 1800s, you know, exemplified by the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so these barriers of invisibility, whether it's the enemy foreigner, you know, cartoon one dimension, or the model minority one dimension, what that serves is to be manipulatable, right? That whatever Asian Americans are, we can be used and manipulated and disposed of as convenient, whether it's today, you know, in terms of fighting affirmative action and pitting Asian Americans and against African Americans, or the way that hate crimes are, you know, toward Asians are focusing only, or hate incidents are focusing only on Black, on Asian incidents, which, you know, clearly the other speakers have pointed out that's only a small minority. So these are part of the you know, it's part of the systemic, you know, way that Asians are used to keep white supremacy in place, to keep racism in place. And we see over and over again that actually it's, you know, it's not being counted, but not being seen as significant, not being seen as mattering to at all to American society. I mean, if you're an enemy invader or you're always a foreigner, what do you have to do with this democracy? And I can think of so many examples, you know, even as a journalist. For example, the 1992, you know, after the Rodney King verdicts and the uprising in Los Angeles that led to the destruction of Koreatown, the LA Times ran a survey on how do Angelenos feel about what happened. They polled white, Black, Latinx, and that's it. They didn't even ask about, well, Asian Americans have been so incredibly impacted by this. Why didn't they ask? And I, as a journalist, actually asked the executive editor of the LA Times, why did you not even consider Asian Americans and how they felt? And he said, well, Asian Americans are not statistically significant enough in Los Angeles, which at the time, Asian Americans had a higher population, a larger population than African Americans. And so this is the answer. It's not that we're not statistically significant. The real view is that we are not significant. And so that is the problem in getting any of the data collection, the stories told. You know, our stories aren't told because we're not seen as relevant. And the only people that can make that change is we ourselves have to stand up and insist, you know, and yes, hold our governmental officials, our corporate officials, our communities and campuses accountable to, but that also means that we cannot believe the toxins that have been spread upon our communities too. This whole model minority thing has, you know, that racist myth has been absorbed by our community as well, in a way that some members of our community think that they can stick their heads in the sand and, you know, white adjacent or honorary whiteness is something that they can hide behind. And I think what we're seeing today is we can't. And if we only look at the stories, the history, that there are so many stories that can be told that shows the humanity of why our communities count, of why every person in America whose parents come as immigrants and why they become American citizens, why they can thank an Asian American, Wong Kim Ark, for that. I mean, if our kids in elementary school knew that when people tell them, go back where you came from, that they can answer, you can thank Wong Kim Ark for the fact that you are an American citizen because my ancestors here made that possible. I mean, those are the kind of stories that are missing. I call them missing in history, that render us irrelevant, that why we're invisible. And so, we have to make them seen. We have to be counted, and we have to insist on that.
So Helen, given the forces that you just spelled out, what is it that people can do? How can they work towards lifting up those Asian American stories, Asian American issues that deserve more attention? It's one thing to sort of do it individually in the place that you are. Is there a call to, in this moment, sort of look around and pick one's head up a bit in a way that I think maybe a lot of Asian Americans are just now starting to understand may be necessary to ensure that things don't continue as status quo for the next generation?
Well, absolutely, Elaine. I mean, I think you hit on it, that this is a time where people, if they thought that they could, hide out and just ride this thing out, that they really are thinking that, okay, maybe there's something I have to do, including have a conversation with my family, my children, understand a little bit more, learn some of this, unlearn the poisons that we've been fed, learn some of the real stories and the real needs of our communities. But it's not just an individual thing. Obviously, if we come together and we work with organizations that every, one of the people on this panel represent, and many of the listeners, are connected to organizations, that there are people out there fighting and doing this work. And so find them, find ones that align with your values, your goals, connect with them, support them, join them. If you don't find one that that meets all those needs, create one yourself and connect. And not just within the Asian American community, but though that is very important, because as everyone has said, we are such a diverse community. If we are united and then connect with other people of conscience, people of color, people who are doing the work to try to, lift up all of our communities, to fight the racism, the violence, the things that are going on in our communities, so that we can just have, live in safety, live in peace, live as full human beings and support the human dignity of everybody. I mean, everybody can find some organizations to support and be part of and do something. That's the main thing. Doing nothing is not a solution. Doing nothing is contributing to the problem. So if we all find a way within ourselves to do something, and there are so many organizations here that can help give you suggestions, that is really the way we have to go, to be activated, to do something.
So much of this in my mind has to do with education first. And Janelle, I want to bring you in here, because this idea of learning about Asian American history is something that, again, I think a lot of people in the AAPI community are just now becoming more aware of, and how lacking their own education was on these issues. So how can people educate themselves about Asian American history, and how can there be more awareness created for Asian American issues?
Well, I love the fact that Helen is on this panel, because Helen well knows and has contributed to a long organizational kind of buildup of Asian American studies. So while Asian American studies is new to many people in this current moment, the organization of Asian American Studies, a collective of scholars that does research and lifts up the stories that you're talking about, has been in existence for decades. And I think there's long been a kind of connection between Asian American studies and the kind of activism that Helen is referring to. And today we have these new tools. John can talk a little bit more, I think, about some of these, where our stories and our research is not just confined to the classroom, but there are more ways to access our research on our communities and Asian American studies through digital platforms. And I've seen this major growth in the kinds of ways in which students and just everyday people can access Asian American studies, and we learn a lot. So, I think not just our history, but the contemporary context is so important here. A recent study that Karthik Ramakrishnan and I did in conjunction with AAPI data and with SurveyMonkey does show that, as you would expect, Asian Americans are the most likely to be asked where they are from, with people assuming they're not from the United States. They're one of the groups most likely to be assumed not to speak English. But at the same time, we see in that same data, a survey that was done 2 days after the Atlanta shootings, that Asian Americans are among the least likely racial groups to have a teacher tell them, for instance, to not to continue their education. They are among the least likely groups to experience police brutality and police misconduct. And so understanding this complicated racial position in which we find ourselves, and the ways in which, I think it's really in the ways in which all of our destinies are connected to one another, is so important. It's one of the roles of Asian American studies. And so, a colleague of mine, for instance, Jerry Park, is one of the leaders in Asian American studies. He's shown that, for instance, white students who buy into the idea that Asian Americans are uber competent, what we have called the model minority stereotype here, those same white students, if they think that Asian Americans are uber competent, are also the students who believe negative stereotypes against Black and Latinx. So these things are all tightly knotted together in the American psyche, and understanding that is what Asian American studies really tries to forward for both students and for the general population.
John, let me turn to you next. But before I do, I want to remind people we are going to have time for audience questions. So please, if you would get those questions into the Q&A section of the platform, we would appreciate it. But Janelle mentioned, John, these tools available, and I wonder if you could talk about that, because as we are seeing change and people start to think about Asian Americans as Asian American studies, you right now are developing these opportunities for people who want to learn in this moment about their own history. Tell us about some of those tools.
Sure. And this is not just Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, that's doing this. A number of organizations are doing similar things. And this is focusing even more on the K through 12 education system, because we all recognize that a lot of the stereotypes, a lot of the biases are learned at that young age. And so one of the things that our organization has partnered with Stuart Kuo on is developing Asian American curricula at the K through 12 level. And you can find it online. It includes teachers' guides. It makes it very accessible to anyone that wants to use it. Obviously, that's only part of the picture. So then what we need to do is to train teachers so that they're competent to use it, to let people know about it. So at the micro level, what we can do is start to get people interested in this curricula. And frankly, one of the things I've been pushing is during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, for all of you that are parents out there that have kids in the K through 12 system, if you could just get your teacher or your school to have a day, or maybe if it's just a couple of hours of education on Asian American history, then you could say you've done your part, if you will. We've helped to move the needle, because everyone does that, even at that micro level. We've started to move the needle forward. Obviously, like for organizations like mine, I also advocate at the state or federal level to have Asian American studies legislation or ethnic studies legislation. Colorado, California, and Connecticut have that in place. Illinois hopefully will get passed in the next few months. We need more of that. And notice that I do say ethnic studies as a whole, because I think Janelle is absolutely right about this. This isn't about just having Asian American history, because part of it, again, is this racism that all of us is facing. It's not lost on me that over this last 14, 15-month period where we've seen so much anti-Asian hate, we've also seen George Floyd, we've also seen Breonna Taylor, we've also seen Daunte Wright. And I could go on and on and on about the number of murders that we have seen in the African-American community. It's not lost on me that we saw the insurrection at the Capitol during the same period of time. And that's also the solidarity that we need to show together in terms of educating the public as a whole, educating each other about the biases that we hold ourselves that we need to unlearn. Because if we're going to combat racism and combat some of these things that we're talking about, that are deeply systemic. We have to be willing to do that hard work. Some of it starts with those small nuggets that I'm talking about. But by taking on those small nuggets, you add one brick on top of another brick on top of another brick. And that's how we build up that house.
Manju, what do you say to someone, though, who may not understand and may be starting from a very green perspective, shall we say, when it comes to Asian American issues, about why understanding this part of American history is so critical and why it's so necessary to be proactive right now? What would you say about why it's necessary?
Well, you know, it's often said that history repeats itself. And so I think, you know, in understanding the past struggles that our community has had, it enables us to know essentially what to expect. Oftentimes, for example, even the voter suppression movement that America is experiencing today is not unlike what happened in the early Jim Crow era. And so we know that it's not just simply against Asian American communities, but also against all communities of color and marginalized groups. And, you know, here's where I would say the issue of representation matters so much. On March 18th, John and I had an opportunity to testify in front of Congress. And this was the first time since 1987 that there was a hearing on issues impacting our communities. 87, that was actually when I graduated high school. So a lot has happened since then. And it's really, I think, a travesty that our issues haven't been raised more often, but it's because of that representation, having Congresswoman Meng and Congresswoman Chu and Congressman Liu also testifying and sharing their experiences, and really having AAPIs there to encourage and train that next generation of leaders. Because we know that when we're in the room where it happens, that we get decisions that benefit us, and that we get our issues raised. I think it's also important, Elaine, to think about those staffers, the journalists. When everyone comes with the same background and the same foundational knowledge about our experiences, they know how to tackle those issues with policy change. And so, you know, one thing I've been so heartened by is journalists like you who have really uplifted this issue in a way that we haven't seen before. And I think if we had not had so many Asian American and Pacific Islander journalists in key roles, we wouldn't have shed light on these important issues.
Yeah, I will say, Manju, I appreciate that so much. And I can just tell you from the discussions that I've had with both AAPI journalists and non-AAPI journalists, there is a lot of learning that is happening, I mean, among all people. And I think that it is so critical to have people with those different backgrounds, those different perspectives, as we think about what of those stories, what part of those stories do we want to tell, and what is the context that we are going to be telling them? As we talked about, I mean, we just don't have enough time to cover all of these issues, but how we frame these stories matters so very much. So our time is running short here, but I very quickly just want to go around before we get to audience questions here in 2 minutes. I want to kind of end with a question about how Asian Americans are sort of meeting this moment right now. Helen, I want to start with you. There are so many challenges before this community right now. How do you see Asian Americans meeting this moment, rising to the challenge of ensuring that, you know, their work, their livelihoods, their experiences are in fact being considered?
I'm heartened to see how so many Asian Americans around the country, as well as, and especially the youth of the Asian American Pacific Islander communities, are just getting involved, doing things, you know, having protests, doing social media, raising their voices, creating organizations, speaking out. I mean, that's what it's going to take. And as people have said throughout this panel, that, you know, the invisibility creates a higher bar for Asian Americans. Throughout our history, the stories of resistance and rising up have been tremendous. and rising up in ways that have affected and benefited every American. So part of the challenge and part of what is heartening to see is that so many Asian Americans are coming out now and standing up. Clearly, we need more. It's going to take our whole community. It's going to take our community in coalition, in working with other communities too, because these aren't just facing our communities, but that's what's happening on the ground level. And if it's not being seen by other people, then, you know, we all need to make an effort to see it and to lift it up because it's happening. And so that's very encouraging to me. I have to say, watching the next generation and the activism that they're doing is very inspiring to an OG like me to see that, you know, that's our future. That's what's going to bend the arc of history toward justice.
Manju, same question. What is it that is encouraging to you? How are you seeing Asian Americans meeting this moment?
You know, Helen really got it right when she said that, you know, our communities are coming together in a way we haven't seen before. And I was so heartened when I participated in a rally here in Los Angeles in Koreatown, where there were literally aunties and grandmothers that were in walkers and wheelchairs. Many of them were monolingual, but they were there beside their grandchildren. You know, understanding this moment and being there to voice their opposition to the hate that's being experienced. And, you know, so one thing I want to say too is oftentimes people talk about how our community has been silent. And I think while there is some truth to the fact that, you know, culturally speaking, we've been told, you know, to keep our heads down and to work hard, as you yourself mentioned, Elaine. But I think that really neglects the fact that we have had a resistance movements throughout. There was resistance to the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was resistance to the Asiatic Barred Zone Act that prevented so many folks like myself from coming to the United States in the 1900s. There was very significant opposition to the Japanese American incarceration. So what we know, though, too, is that our community has been silenced. So there have been many times that our stories haven't gotten out, that we've been discouraged really from sharing our truths. And I think what you're seeing today is really sort of an unshackling of that silence, and for individuals young and old to speak out, to speak to their Congress folks, to reach out to their city council members. I think you need this at every level, not just on social media, but out in the boardrooms, the courtrooms, and our city halls and chambers and halls of Congress really are where you're going to need to see action, so that we can not only address what's happening now, but prevent the hate from continuing into the future.
This is such a good discussion. I knew this would happen. Our time is running short. I want to make sure we get in some audience questions. So lucky you, John and Janelle, you guys get a twofer. So this is an audience question. I'm going to ask you my question first, which is, what actually do you see that is encouraging to you about how Asian Americans are meeting this moment? But also a question very specifically on education. John, let me start with you. What are some steps that we can take to push our local school district for more Asian American studies is the question.
I appreciate that question. And actually, like I said, I almost start with even the micro of starting with your own schools, because that's controllable. If you're part of a PTA, you know, if you have a relationship with your child's teacher, you could address it at that micro level. But then taking that step up, actually, your school board is very accessible. You could easily email the school board members and start to have this discussion. They have open hearing on a pretty regular basis, depending on what school district you're in, to talk about issues like that. If you want to take it one level up from that, think about running for school board. Think about running for those local government positions where you can effect change. Because the reality is we need more Asian Americans to be running for those positions, as well as for positions in Congress or in the administration. So think about all of those different pieces. And let me tie that, I guess, back to your question about what I'm seeing. You know, Helen started with talking about the tsunami of hate that we've seen, and that's absolutely true. We've seen a tsunami of hate. I think we would all agree that we also see the tsunami of hope, the tsunami of energy that we've seen from the Asian American community. You know, when she first became an activist, Asian Americans were not even 1% or about 1% of our population. And so getting the voice that she needed to get at that time looked very different. We're over 7% of the population now. And so we need to exercise that voice in a different way and not be afraid to use it. Use all of our different skills, whether it's as a journalist, whether it's in a corporate setting, whether it's in a law firm, whether it's as a congressional staffer. Think about how you use that own special skill to help our community during this moment.
Janelle, same set of questions. It's a twofer as well. So what's encouraging to you about how Asian Americans are meeting this moment? And also, what can people do? What steps can they take to push local school districts for more Asian American studies?
Thank you so much. I mean, I will just take this moment to give a shout out to the many grassroots and advocacy organizations that have been who were there before this moment and who will be there after the media attention is gone. And that is why I think we have seen a certain kind of very thoughtful analysis of the violence we've seen. So many organizations, for instance, there's a live debate about the role of policing and how that affects communities. Do we meet this moment through community investment, or do we meet it through, doubling down on law enforcement? And I think many community organizations have said, no, we are not going to do the latter. And so I just appreciate that. I think it's been a hopeful, thoughtful discussion. And then on the question about instilling Asian American studies throughout our K through 12, Asian American studies has always grown out of student activism and student voices. And I see that happening in my own district, that there are students in the K through 12, especially high schoolers, who have started to organize. And those voices in the past could not be ignored. That's why we have Asian American studies today. And I see these students organizing not just as Asian Americans, but also across racial lines to demand ethnic studies because of the things that John talked about, that this is a moment where we're facing a lot of racism and students want these tools and want to know their own histories.
All right, final minutes here. Question for Helen. There are many injustices happening in this world that are all up against fighting white supremacy. How can we drive a call to action for AAPI injustices, as well as that for Black lives, Latinx, LGBTQ+, et cetera, equally?
Well, I think for activists, now, in the past, in the future, it's really all about connecting the dots. I mean, none of our communities are really separated from each other in the sense of part of what creates systemic racism is systemic division. And so the idea that we are apart from each other instead of being part of a larger community, a beloved community, is not being able to connect the dots, to see the human commonality that we have, the empathy that what's happening in another community, if they are being treated unjustly, that damages our community. The anti-Asian hate that's going on now, it is part of a larger, series of violence that's really going on throughout the world, actually. And so for Asian Americans, as we seek to elevate our own our own voices, part of that has to include talking about, the other communities that are facing very similar things, or reaching out to those communities so we stand together. That's what's going to really address the underlying problems that we all face, because none of us none of our communities and none of us as individuals can make change by ourselves. Our communities don't stand alone. So the idea that we can just take on issues without joining together with other communities it's just a fallacy. And so whether that's other racial communities around joining together with the Me Too movement, or things around gender equality, or LGBTQ rights, and the homophobia and transphobia that's going on, and the epic proportions of violence that's happening toward the queer communities. I mean, all of those things really are part and parcel of a larger problem that we can only solve together. So that really is going to take all of us. And, you know, as activists, we have to find ways of connecting the dots every time we're out there doing work.
One last question I want to squeeze in here. Manju, this one is for you. How do we frame that anti-AAPI hate incidents are not one-off events to the greater public while our community continues to find its voice to share our current/modern forms of oppression?
That's such an important question, Elaine. Thank you. And I think, you know, I'm hopeful that the data that we provide through StopAAPIHate really provides the answer, which is the context for what's going on. I think last year we began to see some of these incidents, and there was that feeling that they're one-off, that they're happening in isolation. But now with our reporting, also the data from StopAAPI, from AAPI data and other institutions has shown that these are actually widespread occurrences. They're happening all over the country. And sadly that, you know, we know that particular parts of our community are also being targeted. That is women experiencing hate at 65% of those reports are coming from women, also youth and seniors. And so I think having that information and really all sectors, as Helen said, working together, because we know that, you know, from academia, we have that underlying research and history. From our journalists, we're able to uncover these trends and patterns along with groups on the call today. And then from policy advocates, including John and, you know, his organization and others, being able to share that information in the halls of Congress. I think that really not only sheds light on what's happening, but evokes the need to bring about systemic change. And so that's what I'm really hopeful about as we end the conversation today and continue that work on, which is that we bring all of these sectors together to better understand the problem so that we can truly address it and prevent it from happening in the future.
I want to thank you all so much. This has been a conversation that has flown by. I knew this was going to be our issue, not enough time, but I feel so humbled and honored to have been a part of it today. Thanks to APACs, thanks to my panelists, Janelle Wong, Helen Zia, John C. Yang, and Manjusha Kulkarni. I want to let people know this is concluding our panel on the Asian American experience. We will now take a 30-minute break before our next panel. Thanks again, everyone, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.